How does evolution work? Evolution makes sense of everything we know about life. It's a defining process that explains the unity and diversity of life. One botanist claimed that life is the most important thing in the world, and the most important thing about life is evolution. But how does evolution really work? In this podcast, we'll talk about the main mechanisms involved in evolution. In its most simple expression, evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. This is called microevolution. There are three main mechanisms of microevolution. There's natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. Natural selection is the best known by most people. It's the process that Darwin revealed. Natural selection is based on a few key observations. First, for any species, there are more offspring born that can survive. There's a constant struggle for existence, and some of the offspring will die before they reach reproductive age, die from predation, disease, or lack of resources like food, for example. For instance, most insects will lay hundreds of eggs per year, and only a few of these will survive. The second observation is that in any population, organisms are different, and some of these differences are inherited. And the third observation is that in any population, those individuals that happen to have inherited traits that confer them an advantage in their environment have a greater chance of surviving, of reproducing, and therefore of passing their advantageous traits to the next generation. We say that these individuals have a better fitness. Now, due to this process, generation after generation, more and more individuals will have the advantageous traits, and fewer individuals will have the less advantageous or disadvantageous traits. The population becomes increasingly adapted to its habitat. This is called descent with modification, and it is the consequence of natural selection. Let's look at an example. Let's take a hypothetical beetle population. There are two colors in this population, brown and green, and this color is inherited. Let's say these beetles establish a new population on the bark of a tree. Because the bark is brown, brown beetles will have a notable selective advantage in this particular environment. They'll be less likely to be seen by predators like birds. In comparison, the green beetles have a notable selective disadvantage. They are conspicuous on the brown background and therefore are more likely to be eaten. In this particular situation, brown beetles have a selective advantage, and more brown beetles will survive, reproduce, and pass their trait, brown color, to the next generation. After a few generations, most of the population will be brown. It's important to note here that natural selection acts on organisms by determining the likelihood that they will survive and reproduce. However, individual organisms do not evolve by means of natural selection. It is the population that evolves. So natural selection is one mechanism of evolution. It's actually the only adaptive mechanism, which means that it's the only one that transforms species so that they become better adapted to their environment. Genetic drift is a second mechanism of evolution. Genetic drift is an unpredictable, random change in the frequency of alleles in the population from one generation to the next. This is a process that changes the frequency of alleles in a population by chance, regardless of whether these alleles are advantageous, detrimental, or neutral. Due to genetic drift, populations change over time due to a random process. Let's go back to our hypothetical population of beetles. Remember that there are green beetles and brown beetles in this population. Let's say a disturbance or accident happens and kills some of the beetles. The disturbance could be a storm or even just someone stepping on the beetles. In this case, obviously, the likelihood that any beetle will survive has nothing to do with its color. If the disturbance happens to kill more green beetles than brown beetles, then the population has changed. This is genetic drift, a random process of evolution. Genetic drift happens in all populations, but it's more likely to have a big impact in small populations. Here are two examples of situations where genetic drift is likely to have an important effect. The first one is when a small number of individuals leave a population to establish a new population. This is called the founder effect. For example, the population of the Saguenay region in the province of Quebec is descended mainly from a few French colonists. Among these few French colonists, a single individual carried the allele for spastic ataxia, which is an autosomal recessive neuromuscular disease. This individual brought the allele for the disease to a small population so that this original French colonist population carried that gene with an unusually high frequency. Today, hundreds of years later and generations later, the Saguenay population still has an unusually high frequency of spastic ataxia. This is a good example of the founder effect. The second situation where genetic drift is likely to have a big impact is when there is a population bottleneck. For example, when we bring a species of marine mammals to the brink of extinction, we get rid of most of the rare alleles in the population. The result is a population that has much less genetic variation than it originally had. A third important mechanism of evolution is gene flow. Gene flow refers to the movement of genes between populations. It can happen due to migrations or the dispersal of seeds and pollen. For example, several human populations on different continents had been isolated from each other for a very long time. The current migrations of people between formerly isolated populations results in a modification of their genetic makeup. Gene flow tends to reduce the genetic differences between formerly isolated populations. Remember that microevolution is the change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. It's driven by three main processes: natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. But how does evolution create new species? The biological species concept defines a species as a group of individuals that have the potential to breed and produce viable, fertile offspring. Organisms of the same species can share their genes through sexual reproduction, and therefore the species can only evolve as one. So the process of speciation, or the creation of a new species, requires reproductive isolation. Several events can happen here. Usually speciation will happen when two populations of the same species live in spatially separated habitat. This is called allopatric speciation. For example, the squirrel Amnospermophilus used to live on the plateaus where the Grand Canyon is, before the Grand Canyon existed. When the Colorado River started to erode away this plateau, the canyon formed, isolating two populations of the same species. Because of this reproductive barrier, the two populations evolved their own way in their own particular habitat through natural selection and genetic drift, and they eventually became two distinct species. In other cases, speciation happens within a population without geographical separation. This is called sympatric speciation. This tends to happen in plants when errors in cell division form tetraploid tissues, or tissues that have twice the number of chromosomes of the original cells. Now, these tetraploid tissues can form diploid gametes, and self-fertilization, or the union of two diploid gametes, will form a new tetraploid individual. This individual is the first member of a new species because it cannot reproduce with the original diploid parent. Reproductive isolation between species is maintained by various mechanisms. Some of those mechanisms prevent the formation of a zygote, and we call them pre-zygotic barriers. For instance, if two species do not live in the same habitat, or if they do not mate at the same time of the year, then they cannot interbreed. Behavioral and anatomical features, as well as biochemical incompatibilities between gametes, can also prevent the formation of a hybrid zygote. Sometimes a hybrid zygote is formed, but will either not survive or will not be fertile due to post-zygotic reproductive barriers. For example, the mating of a female horse with a male donkey, which are two separate species, forms a mule. Now, the mule is viable, but it's sterile. This hybrid, the mule, is not a new species, it's an evolutionary dead end. The key here is that speciation requires reproductive isolation. Now, over the course of a very long time, several speciation events will eventually lead to the origin of new groups of species and the emergence of new broad patterns of evolutionary features. And this is the process that we call macroevolution. All right, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. You can find more podcasts on my blog. The address is biopodcasts.blogspot.com. Talk to you soon.